I'm now asking Mark Wakelin, to actually bring bring the conference to a close, really. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mark. I am a valued associate of the Susanna Wesley Foundation, and he's drawn the short straw, having to draw this quite amorphous event to a close. But we know that that's what Mark does so well. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue, and good afternoon, and it's good to be here, and this is the last bit, so you're nearly there. Well done. Well, it's been a good day, hasn't it? I think so. We've had a richness of ideas and thoughts, and one of the things that I always find helpful and inevitable in a conference like this is however much you think you've sorted things out, when you come to somewhere like this, they complicate it again for you, which is really good. It's really helpful to have those things. We've had such a richness, and we've had in that time so many stories, which was how David started us off for the day, and that feels to me very much the theme for today. As we've looked at leadership and the different approaches to that and the different stories we have of that. I've thought about leadership and been involved in leadership for many years. In terms of thinking, I've been very much involved in the area of policy and curriculum in educational world, and in works by people like Stephen Ball, who talks about policy as a discourse, a complex movement of power and ideas and people with ultimately unpredictable outcomes. And I felt that very much as we've listened to stories and what we know from people. And I particularly warm to the much more humane forms of leadership. One of the things I discovered in the Methodist Church's reaction to policy from the centre was how annoyed we made people. We are brilliant at one thing above anything else, and it is frankly annoying the whole of the Methodist connection. And it's partly because of that discourse, what we think we are when we're leaders. And mostly, I think, in Methodism, it's because we patronise in quite a literal sense. We take a leadership role of the caring parent type person. And if you're familiar with your sort of Byrne and transactional analysis, you'll know where I'm coming from there. But as I was going around and listening and taking in, I felt that stories was, if you like, the theological crunch that I wanted to come back to. Partly because I know some good ones about leadership, mostly about Norfolk people dying. You know the man who was dying and the doctor went to visit him? It's my favourite story. Most people finish it for me now. They know it so well. The doctor sat with this dying man and he said to his wife, who was sitting by him, she said, I'm awfully sorry, he's very poorly, at which point the old boy let out a sigh, leant back in his pillow, and the doctor said to his wife, I'm so sorry, but he's gone. At which point the old man opened his eye and he said, I ain't gone yet, doctor. And she said, now you listen here, Bo, the doctor, he know best. I say that because that's kind of where we used to be with experts and leaders. We kind of trusted them at one point, okay? And another good story is a man in Norfolk where because of the Vikings, I tell this because my friend who's a Viking is here, when the Vikings used to come, we took down all the signage so they didn't know where to go, and we never put it up again because of the different things that happened. So if you get lost in Norfolk, you're truly lost. And this chap from the city was going along and he saw this, he was trying to get to Norwich, and he saw this old boy by the road and he said, could you tell me the way to Norwich? And the old boy looked at him like he was insane. He said, I don't rightly know, I'd never been. So he was full of fear because people have been known to die trying to find Norwich in Norfolk. And he went off down the road and looked back in the rearview mirror, and there was this old boy beckoning him back with such enthusiasm. So he turned the car around laboriously. He drove back, and the old boy, with great animation, much more than he'd previously shown, was pointing to an even older Norfolk man sitting by the gate. And he said with great excitement, he don't know either. And in a sense, we're caught between those two extremes of leadership, of the kind of leader who says, well, I don't know, what do you want, and the other ones who kind of dictatorial, and this is what you do, and the doctor, he know best. And somehow in that, there's the human complex reality that we've been exploring, of the way that leadership is part of community, and in community is conversation, not just dictation. It is, in that sense, writerly rather than readerly. a form of leadership that you can engage with. You can, in the group we've just had, a splendid group just now, you can resist and in a constructive way be critical of leadership and helpful in that. Anyway, having gone round and thought and possibly do a précis, I thought what we'd do is we'd end with a story. Okay, and this is our story. It's a foundational story. It's a story that shapes us as a people because it goes right back to the beginning. And it tells us pretty well all we need to know about the leadership of Jesus Christ. And it begins with two people because, interestingly, stories are often travel stories and on the journey. And I love that image of leadership as walking alongside, walking with. Well, these two people, one of them was called Cleopas, and we don't know the other person, so given the way Scripture goes, it was almost certainly a woman, because they don't give women names in the Bible unless they have to. And they were walking along, and because they were a man and a woman walking along, they were almost certainly married. So the story is a married couple, Cleopas and Mrs. Cleopas, walking along the road, going back home after the worst weekend they've ever had. This is our story. They used to sit around in the early church, and they used to say, tell that story again about Cleopas and his wife. And they told the story about how they'd had this dreadful weekend. It had been a weekend of disaster and everything had gone wrong. And that was their story. And they were telling each other this story on the road. How they'd gone from a weekend of failure, of betrayal, of terror, of horror, of death, of sadness and of loss. And out the stories poured as they walked from Jerusalem literally into the sunset of Emmaus, walking along that road like a Hollywood couple, talking away. And the words of Luke, it says there, they stopped and were sad. And you can just feel that with them because it resonates with our stories too, like all good stories. And we enter that story as part of the story because we've also been sad and we've also made mistakes and we've also got distressed and fraught and angry and unhappy and afraid. We know what it is to walk that journey from a disastrous weekend into the sunset. All their dreams, all their hopes, they say on the road we had so hoped. And they've all come crashing down as they walk from Jerusalem into the darkening evening, walking along. And we know the story because it's ours. It's our foundation story too. And we know that as they walked, another walked with them. And for me, this came through today as a key thing. If it's about stories leadership, and I think that's the most powerful thing to take away for us, then the key thing about leaders is they listen to stories. Because by so doing, they understand where people are coming from. They get a sense and a logic and a feeling for where they are. And this one who walked with them on that road from disaster into the sunset listened. And they explained to him. They said, do you not know? As the way people who are really grieved think that everybody must know their sorrow, but they don't. And they poured out to him all that sadness and all that anger because they had so hoped, and perhaps their shame, because at the end of the day, when push had come to shove, they had disappeared. They're walking along and they walk with him and he listens to their story, but then he takes their story and he puts it in the context of a bigger story. And starting with the prophets, he begins to put into context everything that had happened that weekend and tries to show them that it was part of something much bigger than they began to think. And that's what leaders do too. They bring hope, we were told. What a fabulous image. They bring hope because they put something that you see with your perspective onto a bigger map, and they can see how that can make a real difference. And they walked and they listened. And as they walked, they were moved and they were impressed. And as the journey came to the end and the one who walked with them appeared to go on further, they wanted him to stop. And they nearly sung, if they'd not known the tune and they'd got the authorized version of the Bible in their hearts, abide with me. Fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide. And he stays with them a little longer. And he breaks bread with them. And that's part of storytelling as well. Eating together and walking together and being in community together. And it was when he broke the bread that the whole of that previous episode suddenly came alive. And they said, as he disappeared from them, "Were not our hearts warmed within us?" That's powerful. The stories that can turn hearts that were full of all that sadness, but now were warmed. And they recognized him with the breaking of the bread because that's what he did. That was his signature dish in good modern catering terms. Jesus broke bread with people. But it wasn't just anybody he broke bread with. The whole point of Jesus' bread breaking, his fellowship, his story keeping, was that he did it with people that nobody else would, just like they felt. He did it with the people who'd made a mistake, who'd got wrong, who were afraid, who were deeply sad, who were bruised and injured through their own fault, through others' cruelty. When he broke bread, that's why they recognized him then, because that was what he did with people like them. And then the story begins to get a pace on it. And you feel that pace. Because then what had taken them several hours, as they'd walked that distance, a couple of hours from Jerusalem to Emmaus, that journey suddenly became speeded up. Because now they turned around, picked up, turned around, set back down on solid ground. They walked back, now away from the sunset, but into the darkness, into the night, into where it had been such a disaster, but also where the sun would rise. And they went back now with a different story. They were story keepers of a new story. He is risen, and we have seen him. And so from being people that were so filled with the horrors of it all, they become people filled with all the possibilities of what it might be. But more than that, not only were they story keepers, they had now somehow been intertwined, swept up into, held into the story. They became part of the story. So that you and I, many years later, can talk about our foundation stories. And we can do what people have done for 2,000 years and tell a story that was true, that made a difference, of two people. One called Cleopas and his wife, Mrs. Cleopas, who had a dreadful weekend and met Jesus walking along the road, listening to them and putting their stories in the context of eternity. And then one just last thought, and I'll hand back to Sue. The thing about this story too is that it's not ended, but you're part of it as well. And maybe you also, and me perhaps too, and somewhere and in some other place when somebody reminds us what we did here, we'll tell a story and you will be part of the story. For you are story keepers, yes, and keep telling it in how you lead and how you were led, in how you listen and how you speak. But also you are part of the story. And people will speak of you with hope because you bring it, with confidence because you gave them confidence, because you were a leader that led in the way that Christ has led us.